Story number 1.
The wind screamed through the trees, shaking the branches so violently that snow cascaded down in thick clumps. Our campsite was barely visible in the whiteout, the heavy snowfall reducing the world to a swirling blur of white and gray. It was supposed to be a fun winter camping trip, just me, my girlfriend Rachel, and my best friend Eric. We had been planning this for weeks, eager to challenge ourselves with a winter survival experience in the backcountry. We were experienced campers, but nothing could have prepared us for the storm that overtook us that night. The snow had started falling lightly as we set up camp, dusting the frozen ground like powdered sugar. The weather reports had predicted light snowfall, nothing severe. But by the time night fell, the wind had turned brutal, howling through the pines, shaking the walls of our tents. I was lying in my sleeping bag, listening to the storm rage outside when I heard the first sound that didn't belong. Crunch. It was faint at first, barely audible over the wind. Footsteps in the snow. I held my breath, listening. Maybe it was just the trees shifting, ice cracking under the weight of the storm. But then, crunch. Crunch. The steps were slow, deliberate, coming closer. I turned my head toward Rachel, but she was fast asleep, her face buried in her sleeping bag. I reached for the flashlight beside me, my fingers trembling as I flicked it on. The beam cast shaky shadows against the thin fabric of the tent, but I saw nothing. For a moment I told myself I was imagining things. The wind was playing tricks on me, then something brushed against the tent wall. Not the wind, not a branch. Something solid. My heart pounded. I sat up slowly, careful not to wake Rachel. I unzipped the tent just an inch, peering outside. The snow was falling so thickly I could barely see past a few feet, but something caught my eye in the dim moonlight. Footprints, deep, precise, leading directly to our tent, and stopping there. The hair on my arms stood on end. There were no tracks leading away. Just as I was about to zip the tent shut, I heard a whisper. My name, not yelled, not spoken, just whispered, soft and close. I froze. I wanted to believe it was Eric, maybe checking on us, but my gut told me otherwise. My breath came fast, clouding in the icy air. Then something moved in the distance. A figure, tall, barely visible through the thick snowfall, standing unnaturally still between the trees. My blood turned to ice. I scrambled back, zipping the tent shut with shaking hands. I shook Rachel awake. Something's out there, I whispered. She blinked blearily, confused. What are you talking about? Before I could answer, another noise broke through the storm. A scream. Not just any scream. Eric's. Rachel shot up. Oh my God! I unzipped the tent and stumbled outside, Rachel right behind me. The wind nearly knocked me off my feet, but I pushed forward toward Eric's tent. It was empty. The flap was wide open, snow blowing inside. His sleeping bag was there, his flashlight still on, beam cutting across the ground. But Eric was gone. Rachel grabbed my arm. Where is he? Another scream. Distant now. Further into the woods. Without thinking, I ran. Wait, Rachel called, but I didn't stop. My boots sank into the deep snow, breath burning in my lungs. Eric's screams had turned into something worse, gurgling, choked gasps, then silence. I stopped running. The wind howled around me, but Eric was gone. I spun in a slow circle, panting, searching. The snow around me was untouched. No footprints, no sign of struggle, like he had vanished into thin air. A shiver crawled down my spine, deeper than the cold. Then I saw it. Not far ahead, a figure stood between the trees. No, not stood. Hovered. It was tall, impossibly thin, its face lost in the shadows of the storm. I couldn't see its eyes, but I knew it was looking at me. The whisper came again, carried on the wind. My name. I took a step back, my boots sinking deep into the snow. The figure didn't move. Then, suddenly, it was closer. No footprints, no sound. Just closer. I turned and ran. I didn't look back, didn't stop, didn't breathe until I crashed back into camp. Rachel was standing there, flashlight clutched in her hands. Did you find him? I shook my head. We have to go. Now. Rachel hesitated, then nodded. We grabbed only what we could carry and left everything else behind, our tents, our gear, even Eric's belongings. None of it mattered. We followed the trail back as fast as we could, moving blindly through the storm. I kept expecting to hear footsteps behind us, but there was nothing, just the wind. By the time we reached the main road, the storm had eased. The snow was still falling, but gently now, almost peacefully. But Eric was gone. We called search and rescue. They spent days looking, but they never found him. No tracks, no evidence, nothing. The official report said he must have gotten lost in the storm, succumbed to the cold. But Rachel and I knew better. Something took him. I don't go winter camping anymore. And sometimes on snowy nights, when the wind is just right, I swear I still hear my name being whispered in the wind.
Story number 2.
The storm came faster than expected. The weather reports had warned of possible snow, but nothing major. We had checked before heading out. 3 days of winter camping in the remote wilderness of northern Montana. No cell service, no roads, just miles of untouched snow and towering pines. It was me, my older brother Jake, and our 2 friends, Tom and Lucas. We had all done winter camping before, but this was our most ambitious trip yet. We wanted the challenge. We got to our campsite by late afternoon, setting up near a frozen river. The air was crisp, the snow packed hard beneath our boots. We built a fire, cooked dinner, and sat around joking and telling stories. Then the snow started falling. At first, it was light, just a dusting over our tents and gear, but within an hour, it was coming down in thick, heavy flakes. The wind picked up, howling through the trees, shaking the branches overhead. We decided to turn in early, knowing we'd have to dig ourselves out in the morning. I don't know how long I had been asleep when I woke up. Something wasn't right. The wind was still howling, but beneath it I heard something else. Crunch. Footsteps in the snow. I stayed still, listening. Maybe it was Jake or one of the guys going to relieve themselves. Crunch. But the steps weren't moving away. They were circling the tents. Slow. Deliberate. I turned my head toward Jake, but he was still asleep. I buried deep in his sleeping bag. Crunch. I held my breath. The sound was just outside my tent. Then something pressed against the fabric. I jerked back, heart slamming in my chest. It was a handprint. I could see the shape of fingers through the nylon. I fumbled for my flashlight and flicked it on. The second the beam hit the tent wall, the handprint disappeared. Silence. I unzipped the tent, my breath coming in quick, icy bursts. I shined the flashlight outside. Nothing. No footprints. No sign that anything had been there. I told myself it had been a dream, that I had imagined it. The wind played tricks on people in the dark. I zipped the tent back up and lay there, listening. The wind howled, rattling the trees, but the footsteps were gone. In the morning, the storm had mostly passed, leaving behind a thick, undisturbed layer of snow. We crawled out of our tents, shaking off the cold. That's when I saw them. Footprints. Circling our tents. They were deep, clear. Bare footprints. No one spoke. No one wanted to be the first to say it. Lucas broke the silence. No way one of us. It wasn't, I said quickly. We were all inside. Jake swore under his breath, running a hand through his hair. Maybe a lost hiker? No one's walking barefoot in a snowstorm, Tom muttered. The worst part, the tracks didn't lead anywhere. They circled us over and over, but there were no approach or departure tracks, like whatever made them had just appeared. We should have left then, but we didn't. We stayed another night. The second night was worse. I barely slept, every sound outside making my skin crawl. Then, sometime after midnight, I heard it again, whispers, faint, carried on the wind. At first, I thought it was my imagination. Then I realized I wasn't the only one hearing it. Jake was awake, his body rigid beside me. "Do you hear that?" he whispered. I nodded. The whispers were coming from the trees, low, distant, but growing closer. So cold. Help me. My breath hitched. It wasn't just one voice. It was many. Then the footsteps came back, slow, closer. Something brushed against the tent. I felt the fabric press inward as if something was leaning against it. Jake grabbed my arm. His eyes were wide, his face pale. Then outside, just beyond the fire's dying glow, we saw it. Tall, thin, standing motionless at the tree line. It wasn't wearing anything. Its skin was pale, almost blending with the snow. Then it moved. Not like a person, not like anything that should be alive. Its head jerked at an unnatural angle. Its arms twitched, too long, its fingers curled like claws. Then it took a step toward us. That was enough. We grabbed what we could and ran. We left behind our tents, our gear, everything. We didn't stop running until we reached the truck, our breaths coming in panicked gasps. The snow had buried our tracks, but as we drove away, I glanced in the mirror. At the edge of the trees, just barely visible in the headlights, it was watching. We never went back. Story the end.
Story number 3.
The snowstorm came out of nowhere. One moment, the sky was clear, and we were trudging through the pine woods, our breaths creating little puffs of vapor. as we hiked up the narrow trail. We had arrived at our campsite by early afternoon, excited for the 3-day trip in the mountains. Just me, my brother Ben, and our friend Derek. We'd been talking about doing a winter camping trip for months, and it had finally come to fruition. We'd come well prepared. A sturdy tent, enough food and water to last, sleeping bags rated for sub-zero temperatures. We were seasoned campers, so we weren't worried. But by nightfall, the weather had taken a turn for the worse. It was around 8 p.m. when the wind started picking up. We were sitting around the campfire, eating our freeze-dried meals, when the temperature suddenly dropped. The trees around us creaked and groaned, swaying under the weight of the gusts. The wind grew louder and colder, biting at our exposed skin. We quickly doused the fire, knowing it wouldn't survive the growing storm. I remember looking up at the sky. An ominous blanket of clouds had rolled in, blocking out the stars, and then, almost as if on cue, the first flakes of snow began to fall. "Looks like we're in for a real storm," Derek said, his voice tinged with unease. He was the most cautious of the three of us. "Yeah," Ben replied, rubbing his hands together. "We'll just hunker down in the tents for the night." But as we retreated to the safety of our tents, the wind howled and the snow began to fall more heavily. We zipped ourselves into our sleeping bags, trying to stay warm. I could hear the storm outside, but it wasn't until the early hours of the morning that I noticed something strange. There was a noise outside the tent. At first, I thought it was just the wind, pushing snow into the fabric of the tent, but then it came again. Footsteps. "Ben?" I whispered into the darkness. Nothing. I sat up, heart pounding, straining to hear. The footsteps were faint, as if someone was walking through the deep snow, moving slowly around the perimeter of the camp. The crunch of snow underfoot was distinct. I glanced over at Ben's sleeping bag. He was still asleep, completely unaware of the sound. I shook him gently. "Ben, did you hear that?" He groggily shifted, eyes half open. "What?" "The footsteps," I whispered. "Someone's outside." Ben sat up, confused. He listened for a moment, but heard nothing. The wind still howled, but the footsteps had stopped. He chuckled softly. "It's just the storm messing with your head." But I couldn't shake the feeling. The hairs on the back of my neck were standing up, and my pulse was racing. Something wasn't right. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. Instead, I lay in my sleeping bag, staring at the ceiling of the tent, waiting for the footsteps to return. But they didn't. The storm raged on outside, and the wind howled against the fabric of the tent, but by morning, everything had gone quiet. When the first light of dawn broke through the tent flap, I quickly crawled out to check the camp. Ben and Derek followed, and we quickly assessed the situation. There were no signs of anyone being outside, just snow. Fresh snow had fallen heavily overnight, completely covering the area around our campsite. There were no footprints, no signs that anyone had walked by, but I still couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. We spent the day inside the tents, huddled together, listening to the wind howl outside. There wasn't much to do in the storm, and we spent most of the day just talking, eating, and trying to stay warm. But as the sun began to set, things took a strange turn. It was around 6 p.m. when we heard a knock at the door of our tent. We froze. There was no door to the tent. It was just a flap, like most tents, and nobody had come near our campsite all day. But the knock, loud, deliberate, came again. Ben and Derek looked at each other, confusion and fear in their eyes. "Who the hell could that be?" Ben asked, his voice low. We all remained silent for a long moment, trying to make sense of the noise. It was a rhythmic knock, like someone was tapping with their knuckles, not the sound of snow or wind. I couldn't stand it anymore. I unzipped the tent just a few inches, trying to peer out into the blizzard. But the snow was falling so thickly that I could barely make out the trees a few feet away. I pushed the flap open just a little more. There, standing just outside the tent, was a figure. A man. He was tall, thin, his face obscured by a hood and snow. His figure was impossibly still, as though he were frozen in place. But something about the way he stood, his presence, felt wrong. "Who's there?" I called out, my voice shaking. The man didn't respond. He just stood there, staring at the ground, unmoving. "Ben, Derek?" I whispered. "Do you see that?" Ben's eyes widened in horror as he looked over my shoulder. Derek looked over too. But when they both turned back to the door, the man was gone. Just like that. We scrambled out of the tent, each of us running in different directions, scanning the snow. The figure had vanished, leaving nothing behind but a blanket of fresh snow. No footprints, no traces of anyone walking through the camp. We were shaken. We didn't know what to think. But none of us wanted to stay another night in that storm, so we packed up quickly. Our gear was scattered across the campsite, and I remember feeling like we were being watched. As we made our way down the trail, the snow was coming down heavier than ever, and the wind felt like it was pushing against us, trying to keep us from leaving. But we kept moving, not looking back. It wasn't until we got to the road and flagged down a passing snowplow that we realized how much time had passed. We had been hiking for hours in the blizzard, and we had no idea where we had gone or how far we'd traveled. When we got to the nearby town, we went straight to the small inn and checked in. But as we sat down to warm up, something strange happened. A man came into the lobby. He was tall, with a hood and a weathered face, just like the figure we had seen outside the tent. He walked up to the counter, gave the receptionist a nod, and turned toward us. When he caught my eye, I froze. He smiled, not in a friendly way, but with a cold, knowing smile. Then, without saying a word, he turned and left the inn. I don't know if it was the same man or if it was just a coincidence, but the way he looked at me, it was as if he knew exactly who I was. I haven't been camping in the snow since that night, and I don't plan to ever again. Story the end.
Story number 4.
The snowstorm came out of nowhere. The forecast had predicted clear skies, but by the time I reached the remote campsite, the wind was howling and the snow was falling in thick, wet sheets. I had been camping in the mountains for years, and I had learned to deal with the weather, no matter how unforgiving it might get. But as I set up my tent that afternoon, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I had chosen a secluded spot for a reason. I was looking for peace, solitude. The mountains were supposed to offer both, but that day they seemed to be holding something else back, something I couldn't put my finger on. The trees groaned under the weight of the snow, and the silence that surrounded me felt unsettling, as though it was pressing in on me. By the time nightfall arrived, the storm had worsened. I had a small fire going, the flames barely visible against the fierce wind. The tent was up, my gear sorted, and I was settling in for a quiet evening. I expected the usual: a few hours of reading or journaling, maybe a meal, and then some sleep. That was the plan, at least. The storm raged outside, and the fire sputtered as snowflakes flew toward it, carried by the wind. I could hear the trees creaking and swaying, the sound eerie in the otherwise still world. I tried to focus on my book, but my mind kept drifting. There was something off about the silence between gusts of wind. It felt like it was waiting for something, or someone. I shook off the uneasy feeling. It was probably just my imagination, stoked by the howling wind and the isolation. Still, I couldn't help but glance outside occasionally, checking the snow, making sure my tent was still standing. At some point, I must have drifted off. I remember waking up to the sound of footsteps, slow, deliberate, crunching through the snow. My eyes shot open, and I lay there listening. It was a soft sound, muffled by the storm, but there was no mistaking it. Someone was outside my tent. My heart pounded in my chest. I told myself it was just an animal, maybe a deer or something else moving through the snow, but no animal walks that deliberately. The sound was too rhythmic, too purposeful. I grabbed my flashlight and held it in my hand, trying to steady my breathing. I listened intently. The footsteps continued, circling the perimeter of the tent. Whoever it was, they weren't in a hurry. It was as if they were taking their time, deliberately keeping their presence known. A cold sweat broke out on the back of my neck, and I resisted the urge to call out. What if it was a person? I didn't know anyone who would be out in this kind of storm. What if they were lost? But as much as I wanted to help, I couldn't ignore the creeping sense of dread that filled me. The footsteps stopped for a moment. I held my breath, waiting for something, anything to happen. But there was nothing. The storm howled louder, and the silence returned, almost oppressive in its stillness. I waited for what felt like an eternity, but eventually I let out a quiet sigh, convincing myself that it had all been a product of my imagination. The wind, the snow, the isolation. I was just spooked. But then, just as I was starting to calm down, I heard it again. A voice, faint but clear, coming from just outside the tent. "Help me!" I froze. My heart skipped a beat. The voice was soft, almost like a whisper, but it was unmistakable. It sounded human, scared, desperate. I strained to hear, my pulse thumping in my ears. "Help me," it repeated, this time a little louder, the words trembling in the air. I had no idea what to do. I wasn't sure whether to call out or stay silent. I knew I had to act fast. If there really was someone out there, lost in the storm, they could be in serious trouble. But then the thought hit me. How had they found me? This place was remote. No one was supposed to be out here, especially not in this kind of weather. I couldn't ignore it. My instincts screamed at me to stay inside, to lock myself in the tent and wait until morning. But the voice, there was something about it, something that made me think it was real. I unzipped the tent flap slowly, just enough to peek outside, my flashlight gripped tightly in my hand. The snowstorm battered me immediately, stinging my skin, and I squinted into the dark, barely able to make out anything through the swirling white. There was no one there. I was sure I had heard the voice. The air was heavy with the silence of the storm, but there was no sign of life. No footprints, no movement, nothing but the shifting snow. I quickly zipped the tent flap back up, my hands shaking as I tried to regain control. It was just the wind, I told myself. Just the wind and the storm playing tricks on me. I couldn't let my imagination get the better of me. But the voice echoed in my mind, and I knew deep down that I wasn't the only one here. Hours passed. The storm didn't let up. I lay awake, staring into the darkness of my tent, the events of the evening replaying in my mind. I kept hearing the voice in my head, over and over again, the whisper, the plea for help. By morning, the snow had stopped, but the world outside was still blanketed in a thick layer of white. The wind had died down, leaving an eerie calm. I packed up my gear quickly, eager to leave. The mountains, which had felt peaceful before, now felt like a place of cold isolation, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't welcome there anymore. As I hiked back down the trail, I kept looking over my shoulder, half expecting to see something watching me from the trees. The thought of that voice, of the footsteps circling my tent, haunted me all the way back to the car. When I finally reached the trailhead, I was shaking. I'd had enough. I never spoke to anyone about what happened that night. I figured they'd think I was crazy, and maybe I was. But I knew what I'd heard. I knew what I'd felt, and I wasn't going to test my luck again. To this day, I can't explain it, but there's something about that place, the mountains, the storm, that still lingers in my mind. Every time I hear the wind howl, I remember that voice, the voice that wasn't lost in the storm, and I wonder if it's still out there waiting for someone to help. Story the end.
Story number 5.
We set out for our winter camping trip in the middle of December, convinced it would be the perfect getaway. The forecast had called for light snow with a clear sky expected after the storm passed. My brother Sam and I had been planning this trip for months. 2 nights in the wilds of Colorado, just the two of us, deep in the mountains. It was supposed to be an adventure, something to remind us of our childhood trips. We both loved the outdoors, and winter camping had always intrigued us, so we decided to take the plunge. The first day went smoothly. We made camp by a small lake surrounded by towering evergreens. The air was crisp, and there was something peaceful about the solitude. We set up our tents, stoked a fire, and spent the evening eating, drinking coffee, and telling stories by the firelight. The snow started to fall lightly around us as dusk settled in, but nothing unusual, just a typical winter evening. We laughed and joked, making memories for a lifetime. But as the night went on, the wind picked up. By the time we crawled into our sleeping bags, the storm had fully arrived. It started howling through the trees, the snow now coming down heavily, biting through the thin walls of our tents. The temperature dropped rapidly, and the fire died down to embers. I tried to sleep, but the wind made it hard to get comfortable. The tent seemed to vibrate with the gusts, and every now and then I thought I heard something scraping at the walls. I convinced myself it was just the wind, causing the snow to brush against the fabric. But I kept thinking I heard something else, a faint sound, almost like whispering. I sat up, my breath clouding in the cold air. Sam was snoring quietly beside me, so I thought it must have been my imagination. But then I heard it again. The whispering was closer now, muffled by the wind, but distinct enough for me to make out the faint syllables. My heart rate quickened as I strained to hear more, but the words were too soft to understand. Still, the sound was enough to make my skin crawl. I stayed still, pretending to sleep, listening for anything else. The whispers continued for what felt like hours, until finally they stopped. I managed to drift off eventually, my thoughts clouded with unease, but the whispers lingered in my mind. When I woke up the next morning, the storm was still raging, but the world outside was blanketed in a thick layer of snow. The forest was eerily quiet. The snow had piled up so high that we had to dig out the doors to our tents just to get out. We both grumbled as we began to break camp, but the quiet seemed oppressive, unnatural even. The wind still howled through the trees, but there was something about it that felt wrong. Sam seemed unnerved too. "You hear anything weird last night?" he asked as we worked. I hesitated, not wanting to sound ridiculous, but I had to tell him. I heard whispering. It sounded like voices close to the tent. Sam looked at me with raised eyebrows. "You sure?" "Yeah, it wasn't the wind. It was clear as day." He nodded, looking uneasy. "I thought I heard something too. Something scraping, like claws against the tent." Now that he mentioned it, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had been moving around us. It felt like we weren't alone, but at the time, I pushed the thought aside. We had bigger things to worry about, like getting back to the car. We spent the next few hours trying to pack up, but the snow kept falling harder. The wind was so intense that it was difficult to even stand still without getting knocked off balance. By midday, we had decided to head out, despite the worsening weather. We had planned to stay another night, but with the snow piling up so quickly, we didn't want to risk getting stranded. The hike back to the truck, usually a quick one, would take us much longer in these conditions. It wasn't until we had reached a point where the trail began to slope downhill that we noticed the footprints. At first, I thought it was just some animal tracks, maybe a bear or a mountain lion. But as we followed them, the strange details became clear. The prints weren't right. The way they were spaced was uneven, and they looked like they were dragging across the snow. Not from walking, from something. Crawling. I looked at Sam. "Do you see that? Do you see that?" He didn't need to say anything. I could tell from the way his face had gone pale. We followed the prints for a little while longer, but they led us in circles, always back toward the same spot near a large boulder. They were deep in the snow, like something heavy had been moving around in the storm, but there was no sign of an animal anywhere nearby, just those odd, dragging footprints. We decided to turn around and head back up the trail. The uneasy feeling returned, like we were being watched, but I tried to shake it off. It was probably just the storm playing tricks on us. When we reached our camp, the atmosphere was tense. The campfire was out, the area now buried under a heavy layer of snow. But that wasn't the most disturbing thing. The tents had been moved. They had been shifted several feet from where we had left them. There was no explanation for it. Neither of us had touched them. We looked at each other, both of us silently acknowledging that we couldn't just dismiss this as coincidence. The creeping feeling of being watched was growing stronger. Someone had been in our camp. We made the decision to leave. We packed quickly, barely speaking. I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone standing in the trees watching us. The storm wasn't letting up, and the wind was cutting through the forest like knives, but we pressed on. The footprints still haunted me. Where had they come from? And who had moved our tents? When we reached the truck hours later, we were exhausted, soaked through with snow and ice, but I didn't feel safe. The feeling of being pursued didn't leave. It wasn't until we got back to town that I could relax, but the memory of those dragging footprints never left me. It's been years since that trip, but I still hear the whispering sometimes when I'm alone in the woods, and every time it happens, I remember that night. The snowstorm, the strange footprints, and the feeling that something had followed us out of those woods. Story, the end.